Let's just lay out what the police case seems to be. As I understood it, and I know we've spoken to you about it, I mean, from the river to the sea is a sort of genocidal statement saying that the Jewish people have no right to Israel, so we wipe Israel off the map, and it also encompasses the extermination of the Jewish people there. So in my view, it's a genocidal statement. At the very least, it's a hateful statement, and I think we have hate crimes. I don't approve of hate crimes, but since we have them, this must surely be a hate crime. But what are the Met Police saying? They issued a statement after we saw that slogan, of all places, beamed onto the mother of all parliaments, Westminster, onto Big Ben. The police said that yes, from the river to the sea in certain settings could be unlawful. And what they're talking about is probably these marches that snake through our cities every weekend. But beaming that same statement onto a building, in this case the Houses of Parliament, is not a criminal act, is not illegal. I don't see the logic of that, and I think that the police should try to find who beamed this onto the House of Parliament and arrest them and charge them.
Yes, well, I can tell you who beamed it onto the Houses of Parliament. It was the Palestine Solidarity Committee, of which Jeremy Corbyn, of course, is a prominent patron. The Palestine Solidarity Committee is one of the organisers of the marches that have taken place week in, week out on Saturdays, intimidating a great many members of the public, including in particular Jews, many of whom do not dare to go into central London because of those marches. And that organisation has a history of some links with some of its leaders in the past to Hamas. One of its former chairs had met Hamas leaders in Gaza, for example. So that's who was behind the projection of that message. And I think that the most clear way to look at this is to invert it. Think about what would have happened if it would have been a white nationalist slogan projected onto Big Ben. What would happen if it was white nationalist activists taking to the streets in their hundreds of thousands, screaming slogans that either were overtly anti-black or had that flavour about them, and alongside them many sympathisers marched who weren't as militant but who didn't object entirely. Imagine if that was the case in Britain week in, week out, and the Metropolitan Police instead were prevaricating and trying to seek for context for some of the slogans that those white nationalists were shouting or displaying on placards. How would the public feel then? But there seems to be a sort of strange tolerance to extremism and racism when it comes from Muslim extremists in this country. Now, of course, not all Muslims are extremists. It's sad that that has to be said, but it's obviously true. But the ones that are very determined and very effective, actually, in intimidating the public and indeed the police and making people feel like standing up to them is an exhibition of some kind of Islamophobia. It's not. You can be completely, tolerant of Muslims in general and welcoming of them to this country, but still stand up against those extremists who wish us all harm, and the Jews first in the firing line.
Yeah, I mean, this tolerance of intolerance, as I would call it, seems to me to be getting out of hand now. What started off as marches and waving certain flags has now become projecting things on the side of the Parliament building. I can tell you right now that when I was campaigning for Brexit to mean Brexit, we weren't allowed to do such things. It does seem to me that they're taking more and more liberties, if you will. But when you talk about intimidating the police, intimidating members of the public, what we saw in Parliament yesterday, despite the Home Secretary telling us we've got a highly functioning democracy, seemed to be the material result of what happens when MPs are intimidated. How did you feel yesterday when you saw those scenes unfolding and Sir Lindsay Hoyle basically said he made that decision because what he doesn't want to have is to pick up the phone and find that one of his colleagues, either side of Parliament, has been murdered by an extremist?
Well, this is what happens when you ignore a problem for years and years, hoping that it will go away and not dealing with it. Eventually it mounts, it grows, and then it comes for you. And we saw that in Parliament this week with those real fears of violence against MPs, which have not been significantly or adequately dealt with in recent years. Now MPs are being forced by the Speaker to bow to those sorts of threats. And, James cleverly said that we live in Britain, which has the rule of law. We live under the rule of law. And that is absolutely true. We do have laws against hate speech and intimidation and threats. But the problem is that the police seem to be either unable or constitutionally unwilling to properly enforce them. We've seen a lack of enforcement of our own hate laws against the mobs in the streets on Saturdays. We have seen a lack of enforcement against hate speech at radical mosques up and down the country every Friday who are broadcasting pro-Hamas messages which are criminal in this country and broadcasting them onto the internet, and still the police are not shutting those mosques down. We have seen threats upon threats to MPs with no significant action taken by the police to get the culprits and bring them to justice. And that lack of teeth, that lack of determination in combating the threat when it appears low level, only causes it to grow and become emboldened. And we're living with the results right now. That's not the sort of country that seems to be under the rule of law. Of course, we don't want to exaggerate. The rule of law, by and large, is followed by most people. But we need to make sure that it's implemented against the very well-organized Islamists who are trying to bring down our democracy from within.
Absolutely. I mean, it's the equivalent, really, as far as I can work out, Jake, of me saying something racist and illegal and the police saying, well, you can't say that on television, but you can say it on the radio, that the medium somehow changes the nature of the message. Well, it does not.
I think it's actually worse being projected.
Or chanting
on the side of
yeah, exactly. So my question to you really is, why is it, I mean, what the police do, it's a bit like the Rochdale grooming gang. You know, they came up with lots and lots of excuses not to pursue these awful people because they were Muslims and the police were frightened of being, tarnished as Islamophobic. So my question to you really is, what we saw, what I think we're seeing here in terms of this projection onto Parliament is the police, just as they did with jihad, sort of looking around for interpretations and ways to get out of going after Muslim perpetrators. So why do they do that, but they never do it for the Jewish community? They don't seem to go out of their way to avoid offending the Jewish community, but they go out of their way to avoid offending the Muslim community. Why do you think that is?
Well, I mean, it's funny, since October the 7th, it's become quite commonplace to see people reaching for the context when talking about calls for the genocide of Jews and trying to diminish and explain this away in a way that they wouldn't if people were calling for the genocide of black people or gay people or trans people. And part of the reason is that anti-Semitism is really endemic in the new progressive left, that sort of ideology which is pushed by identity politics. And unfortunately, the police, as is demonstrated by their rainbow cop cars, are rather enthralled to this ideology. In fact, the Jewish Chronicle just this week exposed on our front page how a Muslim group called MEND, which has defended the jihadists of Hizb ut-Tahrir and led prayers for a Palestinian victory, has been training the police in Islamophobia since October the 7th. It's also been training universities and the NHS and charities. The police are being trained in this sort of sensitivity to Islamophobia by people who have defended jihadists. And that's just part of the problem. It's a whole cultural problem that's being exploited by people who are very determined and organized to try to get their way. And we do see that happening with increasing frequency across the country. And we do need to stand up to it, because otherwise we're going to sleepwalk, as Suella Braverman put it, sleepwalk into our own oblivion.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say that we're not so much being sleptwalked, but driven at high speed by people drunk on their own sense of moral rectitude. But talking about Suella's comments, I've said for a while now we're at risk that the tail is wagging the dog. I think she's gone even further than that by saying Islamists, extremists and anti-Semites are now in charge of Britain. Do you agree with her, or do you think that those comments on some level end up being unhelpful?
Well, what I would say is that in 2016, the chief rabbi gave evidence on anti-Semitism to a select committee. And there was a dramatic moment when he took a piece of paper and drew a black dot in the middle and held it up and said, "What do you see?" And people said, "Well, we see a black dot." And he said, "No, we don't. You see a white expanse of paper with a black dot in the middle." And that's a very good metaphor, because the majority of Britain is not anti-Semitic, just like the blank piece of paper. But there is a dot in the middle that is. And that is the blemish that is in danger of spreading So I think that at once we need to acknowledge that Britain, on the whole, is a very tolerant, forgiving, and decent country. As James Cleverly was right about that, we're one of the most tolerant and brilliant countries in the world. And yet, at the same time, we must look at that dot, that smear, that blemish that's growing of anti-Semitism and intolerance and identity politics that's threatening to undermine our way of life, and